Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of MTS, My Technology and Society Speaker Series. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Carolyn Parkinson today, coming to us all the way from UCLA. Now, I've written a blurb. Carolyn Parkinson here is an assistant professor whose research explores the overlapping neural architectures implicated in encoding human, social, and physical environments. Now, here's the thing. Dr. Parkinson takes an interdisciplinary approach to these questions. So we may not be entirely comfortable with this because she's trying to integrate methods from neuroscience, psychology, social network analysis. It's like pick a lane. I'm just kidding. We love it. So please welcome Dr. Carolyn Parkinson.
Thank you for that very nice introduction and being such a great host. And also just giving me the chance to speak with you guys today. It's been really fun to visit this really beautiful part of California and to talk with a lot of you earlier today about so much of the really interesting work that you guys are doing here. And so in the next hour or so, I'll try my best to retrieve the paper as best I can with just telling you about some of the research that we've been doing in my group. And since this group also seems to be pretty interdisciplinary, I figured I'd tell you about a few different lines of research just to give you a general sense of the kinds of work we do in my group and hopefully foster some interesting discussion in the latter part of our time together today. Before I get started, I want to make sure to thank the people involved in this research in case I run short on time at the end. So especially my grad student Miriam and RAs Brian and Mung, who are pictured here. And like I said, I'm going to go over a few different lines of research today, but really broadly, the sort of common thread that ties together the research I'll tell you about today is that it's all focused on the interaction between our cognition as individuals and the webs of social relationships that we inhabit. And I think that understanding these kinds of questions is really important just for understanding a lot of fundamental aspects of our everyday thought and behavior. So you can imagine on a typical day, if you take basically the simplest possible social encounter that you could conjure up, like maybe you're walking down the street and you bump into someone, how you're going to respond to this person. So things like how much attention you might pay to her, maybe if you stop to say hello, what you might say if you stop to say hello, even things like how much you might trust this person. These are all going to depend in part on aspects of her as an individual, right? So maybe things about her appearance, your knowledge of her personality traits or her likes and dislikes. But how you perceive and interact with her is also going to depend, of course, on your relationship with her, right? So one aspect of this is how close you guys are. So is she a close friend, a loose acquaintance, a friendly stranger? There's also your relative status or roles, right? Is this your boss, an undergrad in one of your classes, an old friend of yours? So of course, it's not just aspects of people in isolation that shape how we perceive and respond to them. There's also the question of our direct relationships with them. But then it also gets more complicated than just that because we each have our own sets of social connections, and then these people are connected to each other, and then to other people. So we're all embedded in these rich networks of social relationships. And information about someone's position in our real-world social networks can matter for behavior. So for example, some people might be better connected than others. Now you might need to modulate your behavior accordingly because maybe there might be more pronounced reputation costs for doing something like divulging some sensitive information or for wronging them or something like that. And some people have even argued, as many of you probably know, that the cognitive demands of just managing and tracking and encoding so many different social relationships in our big, complexly bonded social groups might have been a driving force in human brain evolution. So this is arguably something that's really important to us as a species. It's something that we seem to concern ourselves with a lot of the time, but it's something we really don't know that much about, right? So how does a human brain represent, how is it shaped by, and how does it shape the networks of social relationships that we all inhabit? So with this in mind, the work that I'll tell you about today falls into two kind of broad categories. The first category is basically asking questions about how people mentally represent and reason about social relations, and how that might be similar to or different from how we encode and operate on other domains of knowledge, like spatial relations. And second, I'll tell you about some work relating individual cognition to the structure of the social networks we inhabit. So today I'm going to primarily focus on research in the second category, but first, as sort of almost an aside, I'll tell you about some work in this first category, just to give you a sense of it sort of briefly without going into that much detail, because based on what I know of some of your research interests, I think it might spark some interesting discussions later on or at some point. So, for example, in the past we've done work testing if different kinds of distances from oneself, so distance from oneself in space, in time, or in social ties, might be represented similarly in the brain. So by showing people pictures of objects that get progressively closer to you or farther away from you in terms of physical distance while people are undergoing fMRI scanning, and also pictures of closer or progressively closer or less intimate others, so people's own friends and acquaintances getting farther away from you or closer to you in social ties as a trial unfolds, and phrases that refer to the progressively more immediate or more remote future, so sooner or later points in time. And we found that certain brain regions that have really long-standing roles in representing the physical space around oneself, so like the anterior parietal cortex, encode relative distances from yourself in physical space, similarly to relative distances from yourself in time or in social ties. So essentially, there's one neural signature, sort of topography of activation or closely related response patterns that signals sort of socially close others, close time, space in close physical proximity to yourself, and then another distinct neural pattern for far time, far space, or less familiar others. And so this is consistent with the idea and with lots of sort of related research in cognitive linguistics and social and cognitive psychology, suggesting that we might speak about kind of abstract relations like distances from oneself in time or in social ties in terms of space, because at some level we might actually process them similarly. And in other sort of ongoing related work, we're investigating other ways where there might be some interesting kind of parsimony in how our brains encode and operate on social relations and other kinds of content. So, for example, in one study we've been looking at how representations are organized in a region of the superior parietal cortex with a well-established role in basically directing where your attention shifts to in the physical space around oneself. So this is a really simple schematic, just to give you a sense of it. So we already know that this region has one neural signature for shifting your attention up, and a different neural signature for shifting your attention down in space. So basically, in really simple spatial attention tasks where you just have to follow a shape around the screen and shift your attention spatially based on external cues, you can decode what relative direction people are shifting their attention towards based on the distributed pattern of activity in this area. And now we're testing if response patterns in this area encode shifts of attention in the external space around you and within internal, maybe spatially organized mental representations of social relations might be related. So basically, to unpack this a bit, we can characterize activity patterns here when you're shifting your attention up or down in space, and during a totally different task where you're not seeing anything, but you have to reason about a social hierarchy you've learned about prior to being scanned. So just to clarify, these are just schematics meant to signify what might be going on in participants' heads. They're not really seeing anything at all here, but they're basically having to do a task where they see reference points to figure out who's the given number of steps above or below someone in a hierarchy. This is a visual shorthand. And so we're testing if patterns of activity when you're trying to figure out who's the given number of steps above a reference point in a social hierarchy look like patterns of activity when you're shifting your attention upward in space in a simple visual attention task, and correspondingly if patterns of activity when you're trying to discern who's a few rungs below a reference point in a social hierarchy you've learned look like patterns of activity when you're shifting your attention down in space. And so the idea is that this would suggest maybe partially shared neural mechanisms for directing our attention in the space around oneself and to sort of shift your attention within internal, and you might say sort of spatially organized representations of social relationships. And so the machinery sort of might be shared between these two sort of different implementations. And the idea is when reasoning about social relationship knowledge, it might be as if we're kind of making attentional shifts in these sort of schemas, and we might be using some similar neural machinery to perform these two different kinds of tasks. And our preliminary data are consistent with this idea. And so these are just a couple examples of some of the studies we're doing to try and better understand how our brains encode and operate on knowledge of relations in our social worlds. But as I said, today I'm just going to primarily concentrate on research in the second category here, where we're trying to understand how information processing within individual minds interacts with the structure of the social networks that we're all embedded in. So to tackle questions in the second category, an approach we often take is basically getting everybody in a bounded community, so like a dorm or an academic program, or in one case like a village, and getting them all to just basically tell us who their friends are, using more specific criteria than this, but this phrase for your friends fits nicely on a slide. And then if we do this for all members of the community, then we can reconstruct the social network of the community. And so here are the different colors, which is meant to signify different people. The lines are meant to signify friendships between them. And so doing this allows us to get a really rich set of information about these people without us necessarily having to let them in on what our study is going to be about, and without really having to ask them very much. Right? We just ask them, tick off who your friends are. And so from this information, we can glean things like who is a hub in the network, essentially who tends to bridge between different sets of people or disparate groups, how many degrees of separation people are from one another, and so on. And then we can have subsets of these people or all of these people come into the lab for neuroimaging or behavioral studies, where we can ask questions like, how much do people know about where other people sit in their real world social networks? And do we retrieve this knowledge spontaneously when we see people who we know, to sort of help ourselves gear up for effective and beneficial social interactions? And there's reason to think that this might be the case. So for example, there's evidence that other kinds of social knowledge, like knowledge of others' personality traits, are spontaneously activated when you encounter someone. And sort of the purpose of this is ostensibly to help you prepare to interact in an adaptive and helpful way. So you can sort of seemingly effortlessly kind of shift gears depending on who you find yourself to be around. And in the same way, information about social ties, right? So is somebody your friend? Are they a friend of your friend? And characteristics of their position in the broader social network, like how well connected they are. These things also likely inform our perceptions and our behavior, but as I alluded to at the very start of my talk, there's really not that much known about if and how this occurs, right? So there's a lot of social neuroscience and social psychology research contrasting how we respond to things like friends versus strangers. But there isn't much known about if and how we're affected by more specific social relationship knowledge about familiar others, even though these are the people, like, your friends, your acquaintances, your coworkers, with whom a lot of your everyday social interactions probably take place. And so to begin to get at this sort of set of questions, in the first study that I'll tell you about in this vein, we took all the first-year students in an MBA program, so about 300 people, and we reconstructed their social network just by asking them all to answer this question about who they socialize with most often as part of a classroom activity that they did without knowing that it would be related in any way to an fMRI study they'd be recruited for a couple weeks later. So students essentially just name their friends in the program, and then using this information, we can reconstruct the social network of the cohort. So the circles here are people, line the friendships between them. And I know it's a very ugly graph, and the properties of such a large network are hard to, or rather such a densely connected network are hard to see when showing all the people, all the connections between them. But the purpose of showing this sort of ugly hairball is just to convey to you sort of visual shorthand for we characterized everyone in the social network in terms of their relationships to one another. And then, as I'll show you in a minute, we had a subset come in for an fMRI study. So the properties of individuals' positions in such a densely interconnected large network are hard to visualize. So I'm going to go over some of the key aspects of social network position that we're interested in using a really simple toy network of 13 people where they're easier to see. So one thing you might care about is social distance, and this is pretty easy to get at, right? So it's just like playing 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon game or 6 degrees of separation game, right? So for any participant, like Mary, you can see who she's 1 degree of separation from, like Tim, who she's 2 degrees of separation from, like this Luke character here. And we can play this game for everybody in the network and map out how far each person is from Mary. And you can imagine how this information might have some bearing on Mary's behavior and cognition, right? So for example, the actions and thoughts and feelings of Mary's friends and Mary's friends, or friends of Mary's friends, might be more relevant to her, and she would be more likely to sort of tune into them compared to people who aren't connected to her or to her circle of friends. And we can also extract other information about sociality from the pattern of ties in this network as well, like how well connected each person is to well-connected others. And this might be really important for humans because for us, how much power we have to influence other people and influence things like resource allocation and conflict resolution. These things don't always just depend on who's most dominant or physically formidable or who's most prestigious or knows the most. If you have lots of people who support you, who in turn have lots of people who support them, you can gain a certain kind of social power or status. And so here, we define social status in terms of how well connected you are to well-connected others, or eigenvector centrality, essentially who's a big fish in a big pond socially, right? So you can take Bob here, even though Bob and Tim both have 4 friends, Tim's number here would be smaller because his friends aren't as well connected as Bob's friend. And this is sort of very related to how Google decides what pages to rank highest when you do a web search. So just like if I link to your website to my website, it wouldn't be as valuable to your search ranking as like if the New York Times ranked to your website. Tim's link to Amy is less valuable here to his social status as we're defining it than Bob's link to someone like Leah would be. And a third important aspect of sociality we can extract from patterns of ties in this network is basically who connects otherwise separate people in the network. In other words, who occupies a minimally constrained network position. So basically, people who are low in constraint occupy positions where they can be thought of as sort of social bridges or brokers. So maybe someone like Tim here, you could sort of think of as someone who in high school might have been friends with people in lots of different cliques or could move around recess at the lunch room set of tables. So in contrast, someone like Lisa here only has friends who are already friends with each other. So compared to Lisa, Tim is more likely to be sort of a social chameleon who would kind of shift his behavior more depending on who he happens to be around. And basically we can characterize everyone in terms of how constrained they are in the network. And we all vary on how well connected we are, how constrained we are. We're closer to some people than we would be to others. So together these features describe much of the structure of our social world. And so we can take everybody in this cohort I told you about and characterize them in terms of these attributes. And as I said previously, this allows us to get a pretty rich set of information about these people without having to ask them very much beforehand, without having to really cue them into what our study is going to be about. So we took 21 people out of this network, so the nodes you see colored in peach here, and had them come in for an fMRI study. And for each fMRI study participant, we can sort of look at the network from their perspective and see who's 1, 2, and 3 degrees away from them in the network. And so we tailor-made a stimulus set for each of our fMRI participants participants that had 4 individuals, each of 3 distances from them in the network. So the 2 highest and lowest eigenvector centrality individuals at distances 1, 2, and 3 from them in the network. So the 2 smallest and largest nodes in each layer represented by these silhouettes here. And for everybody in the stimulus set, we had a short video of them saying essentially the same thing, which we showed to participants in the scanner. So they essentially just lied there and they watched videos like this with a fixation crossed in between. And their job was just press a button if you see the same person twice in a row, just to make sure they don't fall asleep on us and that they're lying there with their eyes open looking at the screen. And then after scanning, people completed a brief questionnaire to assess how accurately they perceived the social network positions of the people who they viewed. So just quickly looking at the data from that post-scan questionnaire, so each line is a participant, the y-axes are perceptions, and the x-axes are reality. And in all 3 graphs, you can see that these things are pretty positively related, right? So people tend to know a fair amount about where others sit in their real-world social networks. But is this knowledge sort of retrieved spontaneously when we see these people to help us gear up to behave appropriately? Yeah.
Sorry, I missed, what was the measure for the perception?
Oh, yes, we asked people, I don't have the wording here, but essentially we gave like a lay definition of each term and then asked them to rate on, with a slider bar, how high they perceived each individual to be in that measure. So for eigenvector centrality, this is scientists who study organizations are sometimes interested in who has a lot of friends, who themselves have many friends. Using this definition, how high or low do you think this person is on this measure? And then just drag the slider bar. Yeah, good question. Sorry for not clarifying that earlier. So now we want to see, is this information retrieved when you see the face of someone you know? So to get at this, we use what's called a searchlight approach, where basically we move a sphere-like thing through the brain, and at each point in the brain, we get the local neural response pattern in that neighborhood to each person who you saw in the scanner, represented by these rows here. So each square here is meant to be basically strung out all the cubes in this sphere-like thing here into a vector. There's 123 voxels, which are like 3D pixels to the unit of analysis with fMRI. And so these are just basically each row of the topography of activation across space evoked by each person in the stimulus set, which are symbolized by these silhouettes and circles here, where the bigger circles are more central people and the shade is supposed to convey social distance. And so then we compare these patterns of activity to each other to make a neural similarity structure that basically just captures the distinctions that this area of the brain makes. So in other words, how it organizes information, or what it treats as the same, what it treats as different, and by how much. So you can just think of this as really just a correlation distance matrix. And the nice thing about characterizing the responses in each brain region this way is that we can then go back to the social network data we have and look at the 12 people in each participant stimulus set and then construct dissimilarity matrices for each person, or for each person's stimulus set based on the 3 measures of sociality that I went over earlier. And now, because we've summarized the patterns from the brain data and the social network data in a way that's sort of abstracted away from how we acquired it, we just have these 12 by 12 matrices indexed by person in the subject stimulus set. We can do things like take the neural similarity structure at some point in the brain and then model it as a weighted combination of the similarity structures made from the social network data. So now we can do things like see what kinds of social network information seem to be carried in regions of the brain. And so here are the colors signify what seems to be reliably encoded across people in a given brain area. And without getting into too much kind of wildly speculative reverse inference, you might notice that some of these results might sort of automatically point to testable hypotheses about how different mental processes might be differentially triggered or influenced based on different aspects of someone's social network position. So for example, information about eigenvector centrality seems to be reliably encoded in brain regions that, among other things, play a really consistent role in mentalizing or making sense of other people's mental states. And this suggests the possibility that how well connected someone is to well connected others might have consequences for how much others attend to what they might be thinking about. And so I'll just briefly tell you about some work that we're doing where we're testing this notion. And essentially one really simple way to measure how much people seem to be attending to other people's mental states is with gaze cueing paradigms. And so in case anybody's not familiar with those, I'll just show you what they generally entail. So the participant's job is just to stare at the center of the screen and indicate if a target appears on the right or the left side of the screen. And the only catch is that right before the target appears, the face appears, gazing to the left or the right side of the screen. And even though the participant knows that the gaze direction of this cueing face has nothing to do with where the target will subsequently appear, and so participants know there's no relationship between these things, they're faster to respond correctly about the target's location when the cueing face had just been looking in the same direction. So in the valid trial shown up top here, compared to when the face had just been looking in the opposite direction, so in the invalid trials shown on the bottom here. And the gaze cueing effects, essentially you being fast to respond correctly on valid compared to invalid trials, arises because we automatically track and then shift our attention towards where other people seem to be attending, so to what other people seem to be thinking about. And so the strength of this effect could be thought of as a measure of how much attention you're paying to someone else's mental state. And so if we do care more about the mental states of exceptionally well-connected others in our social networks, then these people's faces should exert stronger gaze cueing effects. And so to test this, we characterized the social network of a different group, this time a sorority, and we had as many of them as possible come in to be photographed, make stimuli for a gaze cueing study where the participants were their fellow group members, shown in peach here. And I'll just quickly show you some of the key results. So on the y-axis, you're going to see the strength of the gaze cueing effect, and the x-axis will be how well connected the cueing face was to well-connected others. And as you can see, the better connected individuals seem to be exerting stronger gaze cueing effects. And this fits with past work in humans and other group-living primates, where you see social attention being modulated by social status, but where status tends to be operationalized in terms of how masculine faces look, or basically how physically dominant they appear to be, with the thinking being that really dominant appearing individuals will be more behaviorally relevant, so it's more important to tune in to what they seem to be thinking and to what they might do next, and to be able to predict these things. And so we're finding that, like dominance, social network centrality seems to modulate social attention. And I think this makes sense given that really well-connected people have a lot of sway when it comes to really relevant things for our participants, like spreading information or shaping norms or shaping their reputations. And so especially like many of the people we tend to study, so like students on college campuses who might not have that many physical altercations on a given day, how well connected others are in their real world communities might be an aspect of social status that might be exceptionally behaviorally relevant to them. And another aspect of social network position information whose effect on behavior we've just started to explore is perceived distance from yourself in social ties. So if we go back to the schematic here that I showed you earlier, if you are this purple person in the corner, is someone a friend of your friend, even if you don't know them yourself, you just know they're a friend of someone who you're friends with, or someone who's farther away from you in social ties. And so specifically, in this data set that we've just recently collected, we're interested in how beliefs about social distance from you in your real world social network would shape how much you value other people's welfare. So we figured out who was friends with whom in a new on-campus group, and everyone on campus also gave us the names and the contact details for some of their friends outside of the community, ostensibly so we could recruit more people for the study. And we also got facial photographs for everybody to make stimuli for a behavioral study where the participants were members of this community. And in the study, participants could earn money for other people in this really simple pro-social learning task. So basically, they choose one of two images. One has a 70 and one has a 30% chance of yielding a reward. And of course, they're not told which is which in advance, but they just learn through trial and error and then choose the option they prefer. And there are 3 different targets who they can earn money for. And for each participant, they're matched in terms of gender and other demographic variables. So one was a friend, 2 others were strangers, one of which we said looked like, this happens to be a friend of one of the people who you named as a friend, so one of those people we had recruited from outside the group. And we said the other individual, which we didn't provide more details about it, they were just a stranger who they weren't made to believe what was friends with them, or friends with one of their friends. And basically there are 2 blocks here. So in the anonymous block, the participants are told that targets are just gonna earn whatever money or they're gonna receive whatever money is earned for them, but they're not gonna know who earned what. So they're just gonna get these big, undifferentiated lump sums of money at the end of data collection, so at the very end of the time we spend running the study. And in the public block, targets are allegedly going to receive all the money that's earned for them, but they're also going to be made aware of who earned what for them and how much each participant could have earned for them had they performed optimally. And basically what we're finding is that people are more motivated to benefit their friends, unsurprisingly, but they also seem to care more about strangers when they believe that they share a social tie compared with strangers who are farther away from them in the network. And this is true when their behavior is just totally anonymous. So in other words, we're finding that people are more pro-social to strangers when they believe that they share mutual social ties. And it doesn't seem to be just a matter of reputation management, because perceived distance from yourself and social ties seems to actually shape how much you intrinsically value others' welfare, because people are evincing these effects even when their behavior is totally anonymous. And so to quickly sum up this section before I just move on to the last study that I'll tell you about, people seem to have pretty accurate knowledge of where other people sit in their real-world social networks. And we retrieve this knowledge spontaneously when we encounter one another. And consistent with the idea that a key reason that we spontaneously retrieve any kind of person knowledge at all when we encounter other people is to prepare to think and act in an appropriate and beneficial way. We're finding that knowledge of ties between third parties shapes how we value and attend to other people. And so the last piece of work that I'll tell you about also falls in the second category of questions, but in this work we took a slightly different approach. So instead of looking at the perception and effects of patterns of social relationships here, we asked if how we respond to the world in general is associated with where we ourselves sit in our social networks. So a lot of us have the intuition that we're friends with others who are like us, right? Or that birds of a feather flock together. This is not by any means a new notion. It goes back at least to the 1500s, probably very sure. And sociologists have confirmed this across cultures and contexts. Humans tend to be surrounded by others who are like themselves in terms of a whole range of factors, like age, gender, and so on. And this tendency is called homophily, or love of the same, essentially. And it's been suggested that homophily might be beneficial because it might facilitate collective action, cohesion, and empathy, since similar others are more likely to share similar assumptions, goals, and experiences. But this hasn't really been tested directly, and in the same vein, you might have the sense that your friends aren't just people who tick off certain demographic checkboxes, right? Like same age, check, same gender, check, same height, check. Within certain demographic groups, you probably resonate with some people more than others. Hopefully you fall into friendships with people who have differing demographic characteristics than your own. But until relatively recently, a really large proportion of the research on homophily had been focused on these kind of coarse variables like demographics. And this is despite the perception that a lot of us have that our friends are people who we sort of click with, right? So who respond to things like we do, and who see the world from a similar perspective to our own. And so here we want to test this notion, and one window into how we respond to the world. So into our thoughts, our emotions, our interpretations, as these processes unfold, is provided by a time series of neural responses to naturalistic dynamic stimuli. So some really elegant work from Yuri Hassan's group and others has shown that if you take a group of people and you show them some engaging dynamic stimulus, like a movie, for example, and extract time series of neural responses from corresponding brain regions as they watch the movie, they become sort of locked together in time. And the similarity of responses, depending where you're looking, of course, is related to similarity of things like interpretation, what people focus on or remember later, how people are allocating their attention, their emotional reactions, and so on. And so if we are exceptionally similar to our friends in how we interpret and attend to and respond to the world, then we'd expect our neural responses to dynamic, realistic stimuli to be exceptionally similar to those of our friends. And so to get at this, we characterized the full friendship network of another graduate program and had a subset come in for an fMRI study where they just watched a set of videos. So this is a pretty easy experiment for our participants, and the videos we showed them were selected so that people likely hadn't seen them before, right? We didn't want friends to look more similar because they had watched the same videos together previously. We wanted things to be engaging, so hopefully they recruit many of the sort of suite of cognitive and emotional processes that characterize our everyday mental life, and also because we want to minimize mind wandering, which here might be a source of noise because different people might mind wander about different things with these sort of stimulus unrelated thought trajectories. We also wanted to choose stimuli that would evoke some more meaningful variability between people, because different people might interpret them differently or attend to them differently or have different emotional responses to them. And so we chose some things that some individuals might find sweet or touching or adorable, others might find kind of cloying or sappy or overly sentimental. We had some things that might appeal to people with certain senses of humor that others might fail to appreciate or in some cases detect the humor in. Things that might be understood or parsed differently depending on your knowledge or interests or background. Arguments that some people might really resonate with, others might respond to with skepticism or maybe even contempt. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of things our participants saw in the study, I'll show you a collection of kind of truncated clips of what we showed them. So in the real study, each clip was at least a couple of minutes long, but here the clips have been trimmed to just be a few seconds each, and there's a smaller number of them just to give you a sense of sort of the distribution of our participants' experiences.
My first spacewalk, I was on the dark side of the world over the Indian Ocean.
By having workers who only had to do one thing, they could pay them a low wage, and it was very easy to find someone to replace them.
The water squeezes out of the cloth, and then because of the surface tension of the water, it's
insulting when a coach is making 5 to 10 to 15 times more than a college president.
These babies are not strong enough to cling, and they fall to the ground repeatedly.
It's at times like that you don't often think of funny things to say, but I did. And I turned to the rescue workers and I said, talk about a rough day at work. That was referring to the spending the time up there being pretty rough. Talk about a rough day at work.
Okay, so again, each study was a few minutes long, rather each clip was a few minutes long. The study, those have just been shortened. And then while participants watched the clips, we measured how activity rose and fell across the brain over time. So on top you see data from 2 participants. It's been sped up a bit to give you a sense of the kind of data we acquired without having to linger too long on the slide. And then on the bottom is activity summarized for these same 2 participants in the circle brain region, so in the superior temporal cortex. And you can see that these people look relatively in sync with one another at times while they're watching the video. They also happen to be quite good friends with one another. So here we want to test if, in general, people who are friends and who are closer together to one another in their social network would have more similar neural responses to the stimuli that we showed them. And so to get at this, for each pair of fMRI participants, we parcellated the brain into constituent regions just based on free surfer anatomical parcellations and some different regions of the brain that we defined, where some of them are signified by different colors here. And then we just measured the similarity of the spatially averaged fold response time series from those regions. And then we can go back to the social network data and see how close together that pair of people are in the social network. And that allows us to relate the similarity of their neural responses in each region to their proximity in the social network. So for each participant, we essentially have an 80-element vector. So we have 80 brain regions in the parcellation scheme we used, capturing the similarity of their neural responses across brain regions. And we go back to the network data and see if they're friends, so characterized by social distance of 1, or friends of friends, so social distance of 2, or farther apart in the network. And then so we label them accordingly, and so first we just wanted to see if we could predict how close or far people were from one another in the network based on their patterns of neural response similarities. So in a subset of this data, we trained a support vector machine learning algorithm to distinguish friends, friends of friends, and so on, based on patterns of their neural response similarity. And then we tested if we could give this model new data from pairs of people it had never seen before, and if it could tell us how far apart those people were in the network. And so, of course, if there was any information about social distance in the neural similarity data, then we'd expect a confusion matrix that looks something like this. So with each distance category being classified as every other one, an equal amount of the time. So the true categories are the rows, and the predicted categories are the columns, and correct classifications would be along the diagonal. And we used oversampling methods essentially for anyone who's curious why it would be the same likelihood of guessing each category in every case. So just we took steps to mitigate class imbalance essentially. And then while this sort of random assortment of responses is what we get when we just shuffle the social distance labels in our data, or shuffle everyone's data and repeat the analysis many, many times, as you can see in this histogram here. In the actual data, we see considerably higher classification accuracy rates along the diagonal, with an overall average accuracy rate of just over 40%. So not perfect by any means, but significantly higher than chance. So we can predict the social distance between two people at a rate above what you'd expect based on chance alone, using their the similarity of their neural responses to naturalistic stimuli. And you can see in the confusion matrix that as you get further away from the right answer, the numbers get a little bit smaller and smaller, suggesting that even when the model's getting it wrong, it's often getting it, or tends to be getting it closer rather than farther to the right answer, although there aren't that many possible category labels, so it can't really get that far from the right answer in our data. And you can also see that there are 4 categories of social distance in this data set, but in the interest of simplicity and time for the last few minutes of my talk, I'm just going to hone in on these distance 1 to 3 dyads, but I'm happy to talk more about the distance 4 dyads with anyone who's curious afterwards. It's just a little bit more of a time-consuming story to tell. So you may be thinking, okay, you can classify social distance based on patterns of neural response similarity. This is the case that friends are actually more similar to one another. People in general closer together in the network are actually more similar to one another. So we can go back to those vectors we have for each dyad and just group them by social distance. So these are just going to be descriptive statistics, essentially. I'm happy to talk more about some of the tests we did afterwards, anyone who's interested, but I just want to sort of give you a quick summary of the pattern of results. So here, warmer colors are going to mean more similar than average for a given brain region. Cooler colors are going to mean less similar than average for a given brain region. And for people who are 3 degrees of separation from one another in the network, we're seeing cooler colors, suggesting that these people who aren't friends with one another or one another's friends are responding pretty dissimilarly to one another. And the opposite seems to be true for people who are 2 degrees of separation from one another in the network. So here we're seeing warmer colors, suggesting that these people who aren't friends with one another or with one another's friends are responding to what we showed them more similarly to people who are farther removed from each other in the network. And then if we look within friends, in many regions we're seeing much warmer colors, indicating that these people are responding to what they're seeing in an exceptionally similar way. And this pattern is especially pronounced in regions that determine things like how we allocate our attention, like the supraparietal cortex, which I told you about earlier in a different context, where friends are especially similar to one another, and the similarity decreases with increasing social distance. And the pattern of results here looks essentially the same when we control for similarity and all the demographic variables that we're able to collect and measure, like similarity in gender and age and ethnicity and nationality and so on. And so to return to the question I began the section with, so do we see the world like our friends do? It seems like we do tend to be surrounded by people whose brains process the world similarly to our own. And so now going forward, we're doing further work, including longitudinal studies and work using more constrained paradigms and also more targeted behavioral paradigms that will allow us to ask questions like, to what extent do we associate with people who are already similar to us and how they respond to the world? And to what extent do we sort of align ourselves with or grow similar to those around us over time, and in what ways? And so to very briefly sum up the various studies that I told you about today, hopefully what I've shown you is that there's at least some common neural architecture that seems to be involved in representing and reasoning about social relations and analogous relations in other domains, like in spatial terms. We also accurately perceive where other people sit in our social networks, and this information seems to be somewhat privileged. So we process it automatically when we just see the face of someone who we know, and then this ends up shaping downstream processes, like how much we attend to other people's thoughts. And finally, we're beginning to see some interactions between how we process the world around us and how our social networks are organized. So we tend to be surrounded by people who see the world in a way that's more similar to our own. And so I think that by sort of combining these almost traditionally siloed approaches from social psychology and social neuroscience, which tend to focus on the individual, with methods from social network analysis that allow us to really comparatively richly characterize people's social environments, we can open up a lot of what I think are kind of exciting questions. So in general, I think it's important to realize that if we really want to understand social thought and behavior, we can't just treat people as isolated units, or really even as dyads, and expect to be able to tell the whole story, right? So even when we're just looking at 2 people having a conversation or interacting in some way, oftentimes what's sort of going on under the hood, so how they're perceiving and reacting to each other, how they're influencing and being influenced by one another, this all often seems to take into account the network of social relationships that we're all embedded in. So with that, I just want to thank you for your time and attention and for giving me the chance to speak with you today, and I'd love to chat more with anyone who's interested in the remaining time.
Well then, I wish we had a mic for you to talk. That was not terrible. Okay, so and keeping with our custom, we have the students enrolled in the seminar ask the first 10 or 15 minutes of questions, and then we open it up. Any questions?
Okay. Yeah.
What would be your opinion, given the work and your first point of conclusion, on the ecological intelligence hypothesis that the intelligence that we have developed from an evolutionary perspective stems from our foraging
Yeah.
ecological things?
Yeah, so I'm in no way someone who has like a very strong stance on like the social brain hypothesis versus other theories. I do think it's something that seems to be quite important to us, just like tracking our social world and behaving in a way that's appropriate given information about where other people are in our networks or how they relate to us. It's really great. It's like by no means a settled issue, but I guess just for me, I guess the fact that it's pretty widely argued, and there seems to be at least some evidence in support of it. It's at least evidence that it's something that seems to be really important to us. But I don't have a very strong stance on if it was like a really critical selection pressure. I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah. Awesome. So I'm going to ask two quick questions. Real quick, could you go back to the last brain maps that you showed us, where it was closeness between the dyads, that's the one. So it looks like in the distance one, they're not just closer to one another, but they're also further from one another than any of the other sections, at least when it comes to the what I imagine is the somatosensory.
Yeah, so
cortex.
that's a really salient point. So I should note that if we just perform basically region-wise analyses iteratively at each of these parcels, some of these, obviously you would imagine, not all of these regions have significant relationships between responsibility and social distance. Two sets of regions where it is a case is the primary somatosensory and motor cortex bilaterally, but I think that's probably rooted in the kinds of stimuli we're showing them. So in general, even if you weren't looking at the effects of social distance, if you show people audio-visual movies, you see really strong synchrony essentially between people in primary visual cortex and also later visual areas. And as there's more and more like coherent meaning in the videos, so there's actually like a narrative arc and a director who's like guiding people's attention to inferences, you see really significant synchrony in sort of canonically higher level areas of the default mode network and so on. But you don't really see systematic effects in primary somatosensory or motor cortex, although I'm sure you would if you had people entrained to one another in terms of some movement that they're doing, or if you were touching, like giving people a common like somatosensory stimulus to entrain to. The regions that we do see a significant relationship between similarity and social network proximity in were largely so the SPL I'm showing here, also the angular gyrus, which in some of your sensory work, so it's a pretty functionally heterogeneous area, but there's work showing that if you give people a common set of expectations or knowledge before they are exposed to a sort of ambiguous stimulus, so before they hear a story essentially and they hear about the character's reported motives, you see more similar time series of neural responses among people who had similar sort of expectations or frames of reference. So this could be like an endogenous way of considering that. Also in some areas of the striatum, the amygdala might have to do with what's especially salient to or different in terms of affective responses across people. And also the spiritotemporal types. But a lot of these aren't significant. Just sort of to give you a sense of the overall patterning of results. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up to that. I was curious with regards to looking at this as a social cognitive construct in comparison to potentially a cultural cognitive construct. So in English we use a lot of our language has that embedded in and has distance embedded in a lot of how we speak about social interactions. Do you know if this would extend or to other cultures, or maybe there's exceptions to these sort of
to describing social relations
in spatial senses?
I would guess. I know there's cross-language analyses of this in the temporal domain, looking at the pervasiveness of spatial metaphors for time. I don't know of analysis in that being for social relations, although I would guess it would be ubiquitous because there's a lot of ways in which this is veridically true, like you hold someone closer when you're comforting them, you're physically closer to the people for whom you're caring or who are caring for you, usually than to strangers. The distance at which you can comfortably stand from someone differs. Functionally really true. So I would guess those kinds of things would be ubiquitous. We're gathering some data now with some collaborators in South Korea, where we have this village on an island who are pretty cohesive and bounded as a community, and getting some neural similarity data on them. But that's the closest we have in terms of cross-cultural research on this family of topics. This was an interesting question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You might not even be taking a position on this, but I'm just curious how much you think that people, when you say that people process something similarly and you can look at the neuroencoding and see that, how much of that is because of some innate similarity between the people versus that, friends have likely seen the same thing. So if you're watching people watch movies, right, the same group of friends might have all seen some of that material before, might be familiar with it.
Yeah, so we tried our best to equate those things, but we should probably, in general, there's some similarity in their media consumption or their media diet, perceiving their participation in the experiment, both with respect to what kind of videos they've seen, but also maybe more broadly, similarities in their environment probably exist that shape how their expectations unfold, what associations they make when viewing the stimuli, how they're interpreting the stimuli in terms of integrating what they're seeing into their existing knowledge. So I see that as something that's inherent in the data. So because in general, I think this, similarity in your environment over the course of your life is probably really important in establishing the kinds of processing styles that are going to be coloring a lot of these sorts of results. So yeah, we try our best to make sure that people haven't seen these particular groups before. But beyond that, I think there's going to always be similarities in the kinds of things they've seen over the course of their lives, or what people have told them, how people have treated them, what kinds of experiences they would have had. I will say, in some ways, it could be nice as a pretty homogeneous sample of MBA students in a rural northeastern community. So they're all pretty similar to one another in terms of a lot of their earlier life experiences, I think. Usually, I think that would be a really big shortcoming. This work, maybe in this sense, can be something of a nice sort of control in a way. We have rose-colored glasses.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
This might be a silly question, but do any of your data speak to the asymmetries people may feel about their relationship? So like, I may consider Amy a friend, but she considers me an acquaintance and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So we didn't look at the asymmetries, but we did consider that when defining the ties. So for example, I just spoke about everything as if the network was undirected for the sake of simplicity. But so for when looking at social distance in the fMRI study, because what's important for us is the participants' perceptions, right? So outgoing ties are important there. So the distances used to construct the stimuli with respect to what distances the people fall from them in the network, those are all based on outgoing ties, but when computing something like eigenvector centrality, that's all based on incoming ties to whatever node it is, because when we're thinking about, I guess, like prestige-related measures, it seems more relevant to focus on who many others consider their friend. Hi, I think you're
Okay, sorry. So in your social network schema, you had one of the factors was constraint, and to my understanding, constraint is how mobile an individual is within that social network, and if he or she can go from having many ties or one single tie.
Basically, so we use BERT structural constraint measure, which is essentially like a weighted combination of what proportion of your ties are concentrated in a single tie, and then going 1 degree out, what portion of those individual ties are accounted for by one of their individual ties, essentially. So it's basically, you think of it as like quite similar, well, in some ways, to like betweenness centrality, like you tend to often fall in the shortest path between two individuals in a network, but we wanted something that was more defined just based on local ties, because I guess you could have two people that have, or one person with a really high betweenness centrality score because of not their own social ties, but of ties of the people around them. They could just end up as the shortest path between lots of other people because they're connected to someone who's sort of a bridge, so to speak, whereas a BERT's constraint measure is like more, it's defined just based on going 2 degrees.
Thank you for clarifying that. So, so I wanted to know how, if you have an intuition about how those neural response similarities can diverge or converge over time when you get closer to someone or when you get apart.
How in this study, or you mean the previous?
In this study, actually.
In this study? Oh, so related to constraint?
Because it seems that those neural responses are tied to a specific moment in time in which those people are friends at that moment.
Oh, I see what you mean. Sorry, I misunderstood you first. Yeah, so we're right now in the middle of data collection for a longitudinal study where we scan people before they meet each other when they first arrive on campus, and then we're going to scan them a year and a half later after they've had lots of time to sort of influence each other in the wild and, you know, forge whatever relationships they're going to forge. And then we can look at changes over time and who becomes similar to one another in what ways and how that relates to their relative positions in the network. Although we don't have data on that now, I think it's really important. I think you had your hand up in the back.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Okay, so have you, or has it been done like where you're looking at social distance and they're close, right? But you can also have like, for example, like a close friend or a family member. You happen to have a really close social distance, but you completely disagree on a bunch of things.
Oh, yeah. So certainly this is not saying you'll be similar to the people who are closer to social ties in every context. So in terms of like every social tie or every issue or potential stimulus. Just like a general tendency trying to observe across individuals. And so certainly this isn't true all of the time. it's significant when compared to random, but like,
Yeah.
it's not, I guess, totally, it's not the whole picture.
So like the reason I bring it up is because it kind of sparked an idea of like, oh, this reminds me of like in the complexity matching literature, when two people are having a friendly conversation, the statistical sort of complexity of their speech signals sort of kind of have this sort of matching effect, right? As opposed to when they're just not arguing, or they're arguing and they're talking about things and they're just not giving each other space, sort of in their prosodic structure, as opposed to having like a friendly conversation. And this sort of reminds me, like maybe there's some sort of agreeability with people that we're really close to, and that sort of gives us sort of like this space where we want to think like them because we want to be coupled with them because they're important.
Oh yeah, I think it's interesting to think about. I guess I could also imagine the causal ergo in the other way too, with respect to like people who are similar to you, may be just easier to interact with because it's easier to predict what they're going to say or how they're going to speak next, and to have kind of a very fluid and low effort interaction, and they reinforce what you believe or how you believe you should act. It's also, interesting to think about that as well, where you might be motivated to see things similarly to your friends. It would be interesting, I guess, then you might also expect that you might see differences in terms of the magnitude of these kinds of effects when people are doing something by themselves versus around others. You might be more motivated to like converge with your friends if they're either with you or made more salient to you or something. It's an interesting idea. Hey.
Going back to the basic at home, if you're asking to see dynamic, and there's when, and that also relates to the point that Morgan brought up about the cross-cultural language, because in many languages you have different word forms for the respect you give someone, and it comes very innately and naturally to the language speaker. So it has always been a personal interest of mine.
I was looking at the so with leader follower who's during an interaction,
like a parent-child relationship, or someone senior to you, someone who you look up to or you're supposed to look up to, kind of dynamic.
Yeah, it would be interesting. Yeah, so this is certainly just limited to one particular kind of relationship here. Working on some studies now with multi-relational networks, multi-layer networks. Each layer is defined by a kind of affiliative social tie. So we can look at importance of or distance between people within and across layers, but even then, we're just looking at affiliative ties that are also still kind of equal. They're based on, they're not based on like a leader-follower relationship. So definitely interesting to extend things in that direction.
So at this point, we can open the floor to anybody, including students.
One general lesson from the birds of a feather stuff is that there are non-social variables that correlate with your social variables.
Yes.
Now, if we take that back to the spotlight work, it introduces questions about confounds.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
Right?
Yeah.
So just to take a shot in the dark, maybe people with small social distance, I have higher frequency experience with their faces. Maybe some of the other measures, I've seen that face in a group more frequently, or I've heard the name more frequently.
Yeah.
So how do we know that these are knowledge about the social structure and not something that's correlated with the social structure?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. For some of the things that will be confounded, I don't think there is really a way to remove their influence totally. Like, I think frequency of hearing about or seeing individuals, and it's thought to be one way. Some of Matthew Jackson's work, he posits that it's one way that we learn about centrality. So people are really accurate at estimating, like, if you want to get a message out who should you tell? And so he has some really interesting work showing that it's really easy for people to guess accurately, and the people who they identify are the people who will be highest in terms of variance of eigenvector centrality. And there's an idea that you don't have to have this mental map of this whole social structure to do that. You can just, basically who you hear spoken about a lot or gossiped about, you can just kind of really, in a very non-ethical way, glean who is a key player, sort of. And then with social closeness, I think there's be confidence there as well. So, and then even beyond what you said, there might be stimulus level issues like with how people appear. So one thing I would like to do is show these stimuli to people who don't know them, but we don't have the permission of them in this case, because the way we got these videos is they made these videos to introduce themselves to their essentially professors and classmates on this like local area network. So one thing we're doing now in lieu of that is people learn in this really boring and long pre-scan paradigm fictive network structure, and then they view the faces from this fictive community that they've learned about while being scanned, and look at the spatial localization of those results. It's not perfect, but to the extent that we see similar results in that city, even though we're taking out a lot of information that might be useful, then that might suggest that the results shown in that prior study were not the results with some of those potential compounds.
If nothing else, you could include in the study where you're having them study the network, people that have not studied the network, to see whether
Yes.
there are other variables that are giving rise to some patterns.
We also, so one thing we're doing there is we shuffle the assignment of face to network position across people, so then we can look at the effects of just the stimulus appearance decoupled from the network knowledge. And I guess, yeah, we tried our best. So we did, in that study, we also did a version of the analysis where we included like control, like covariates for like similarity in terms of like the big 5 personality traits of faces, and some aspects of visual similarity, like amount of motion or optic flow in the videos, to try and account for those sources of variance that way, but I don't think it's perfect, so I think it's probably still definitely complicated.
Thank you.
So that was great, really interesting. I like the attention modulation account of the neural response similarity. That's very interpretable. I can imagine somebody else, I'm not into clothes, but if me and my friend were into clothing, we'd be noticing the clothes people are wearing, or if people are into skin, people's complexions and so forth. And I guess it just suggests an experiment where you just looked at eye gaze in dyads. And has anybody done that? It seems like a kind of low-hanging fruit.
I guess in dyads.
So you watch two people, different pairs of people, or a bunch of people watch videos, you do eye tracking, and then do the people who are similar on this metric look in the same places?
Oh, yeah, I don't know if data in that thing. That is something where so we're getting eye tracking data in the scanner on some of the data we'll be acquiring in the next academic year. And that's one thing that I think we want to look at, also to be able to control for, but also it's interesting in and of itself as a measure of over attentional shifts. To my knowledge, people haven't really looked at that. Yeah, but yeah, I agree that would be really interesting and sort of much cheaper.
That's a quick follow-up too.
Yeah.
So I guess sort of on topic of controlling for that, I'm thinking, well, how much is this dominated by that? Just the gaze shift correlations? Because I just intuitively, it seems like the other thing that might be similar, you mentioned earlier, would just be what your mind wanders to, the associations that arise. And I mean, is there anything you can get out of the data from that?
Here, I will say that in terms of in general, looking at intersubject similarity when people watch videos, in some studies they've had people fixate at the center and found similar results in terms of to what you see in other studies. But I mean, I think that also maybe changes the experience a little bit. I think a lot of the regions where we observed significant results aren't systematically related to attentional trajectories, although everything could be modulated by attention in a sense. So trying to get how you find attention, I guess. So I think it would account, my intuition would be it would account for some, but not all of the results that we saw. I mean, I think some of the other results we saw have some pretty clear interpretations, like the nucleus accumbens seem to have especially similar response trajectories among friends, and as you can imagine, it's not really that far-fetched for similar people to find similar time points rewarding watch videos. The nice thing about the continuous measure is, like, even if two people were to give similar behavioral ratings for a video, or I guess whatever, you could also do that continuously, but it's nice to be able to see, like, do you both get the joke at the same time, or are you both liking the same parts of what you saw, that kind of thing. Yeah, so I think that, to get back to what you actually asked, I think that attention probably accounts for a significant part of what we see here, but I wouldn't reduce all of the effects to it if I were speculating. Hi.
So I just wanted to extend Jeff's prediction, and that it's shared attentional networks that get activated in people that are closer in social distance. Then further down the road, they probably are remembering the same things that they saw at an event, right? So I'm sort of taking the Uri Hassan work like one step further. If there's similarities in neural activation, then people who are likely to be close in a social network, like if you ask them 2 years down the road, what did you remember from what you saw? They will probably recall more similar features. Is that a prediction you could make?
Yeah, so actually in the longitudinal study we're doing, we have, so for just 3 of the videos, because we were short on time, so we get some behavioral ratings after they watch, after they get out of the scanner, and then we also record them just freely describing what they saw, and then we want to basically do some analyses of the transcript text and see if what they focus on essentially, or the kinds of topics about which they speak, are more similar. My friends both, like, right after and maybe along, I guess, a year or so later. Yeah, I agree, it's really interesting. And we do see some of the, some interesting results, I guess, in the hippocampus, which is not really memory related. I think, so one analysis we're hoping to do, and this data from some of the new data, is basically segment the videos into events or scenes, and then look at, based on some of Chris Baldessano's work, look at the amplitude of the hippocampal response right after a scene ends, because there's some data from his work showing that could be related to the encoding of the preceding scene into memory. So just look at the similarity of those post-event hippocampal activations.
Actually, just a quick question about the folks in your network that are operating as hubs. Did you notice anything significantly different about that group as compared to the people on the periphery, in particular with regards to their closeness of their friends? Are the people at these hub positions just sort of the average of whatever subnetwork they're in, or are they more tolerant of a larger range of distances between them and their
in the
friends?
study?
Yeah.
So this is a pretty densely connected network, so there aren't, like, clear communities, like really delineated communities here. But one sort of interesting thing that came out of the hackathon project lately that we're starting to develop into a paper is that basically the people who are really central in the network are all really similar to one another and how they're interpreting videos, and then the people who are peripheral in the network, thinking of that way, or less centrally, they're all different largely from more central individuals are all kind of different in their own ways. You can think of it as like everyone's not, people who don't fit in are all not fitting in discrepant ways, maybe. Well, this is like kind of fast and loose analysis in a hackathon, but other than that, I mean, as you would imagine, they have fewer friends by definition of their periphery, and generally their friends would be low centrality. We have kind of low sample sizes here, though. Here it's 42 essentially unique individuals. In the other studies, it's a bit lower. And so to look at individual differences, generally we want significantly higher sample size. So we haven't really looked into individual differences at the level of centrality kind of thing very much, especially I get that question a lot with respect to the like gaze cueing study. There we don't, because there's some, you might expect that the centrality of the perceiver should make a difference there. We don't see any effect of that, but it could be a power issue, so it's just hard to know the null effect. But if we don't have that much power, what to ascribe it to.
Sort of follow up on that. There was, I forget his name now, there was a researcher here a while ago who was working on research on humor, and his like theory was that humor is like it's a secret key.
Tom
sort of,
Flamson.
Right? What was his name?
Tom Flamson.
Tom Flamson. And it reminded me kind of what Morgan's question was about the people who are central to the network. His idea was that like you use humor as a secret code to see if people are like you, right? So you say something that could be a joke, and if other people laugh, and you know, okay, these people are similar to me, right? And so I think like something in the same vein here with the people who are central to your network, right, might have just, you know, the signal that's most average for that group or whatever, like you were saying. I don't know, it just seems related.
Oh yeah, it's interesting to think about how people might use these kinds of phenomena to assess who's maybe compatible with them or who will be on the same wavelength with them. That's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that. It's just really cool. So people put like feelers out.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Could it be costly?
So, kind of on the reverse note, let's talk about hatred and antipathy. I'm curious how you think your overall, I think this is pretty far afield from the something you shared today, but in terms of your interest in the neural representation of interpersonal relationships, it seems like there's a lot to be done there with, it would be difficult to get actual social networks. I would hope it would be difficult to get actual social networks characterized by actual antipathy as opposed to just indifference. But you could do it with the kind of semi-fictive relationships we have with political figures and celebrities and so forth, or even shared literary worlds or things like that. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or interest in
Yeah, that's interesting. I think in particular with the first I talked about the shared representation of like, social and physical distances, that I think really relevant because I think probably the like latent information that might be represented there could be self-relevant essentially, right? Even though it's like relative, if it's like the way we constructed the trials, it's like is something coming closer to you or farther away from you, but seeing that in social ties or in time or in space. But it's still becoming like more self-relevant or less self-relevant. And so even though I think in a lot of the work on psychological distance in general, affinity and self-relevance are usually compounded or conflated. And so I would think if you have someone who you feel a lot of antipathy towards, but who is consequential to you, but you would see similar effects to what you see for a friend, compared to someone who's not relevant to you with respect to like distance encoding. It would also be cool to look at with fictive relationships. Probably be easier to do it in like allocentric way there, like with if you have people watch a TV show or something and learn about the relationships or something like that in that way. It would be cool to look at not just affiliative ties. yeah, certainly, yeah, they're certainly really important. I've just neglected them.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Because that's totally what I was thinking as well. So like for me, like my wife and Mitch McConnell would maybe both look similar for very different reasons. Because they're so like the one is there's such strong antipathy, you can decide which one. Is that a problem though, in a way for the framing of, like, would you basically say, on the one hand, we've got this kind of neural metaphor co-optation story where social and literal distance are using the same circuitry, but then you can toggle it to be now self-relevance. Is it different co-optation, or is it more parsimonious to say they're both just self-relevance?
I guess to me, I don't see it necessarily as a problem. It's just, I think it's something I sort of speculated to myself that was one potential explanation. I guess part of the reason I speculate that is because in the behavioral work you see parallel effects for distance from oneself in the domains which I mentioned, but also for like hypotheticality or probability, and so those seem like very self-relevance related. And then it also seems to make sense that anterior IPL, this region where we see these effects, is sort of an area that in some research suggests it sort of works as like a switch to arbitrate between recruiting the default mode network and maybe promoting more internally directed thought in a really general sense, or the dorsal attention network to like attend to the external environment. And I can see like just self-relevance being one important piece of information that would determine what you need to be attending to, like your own thoughts or the world around you. I think it's kind of interesting. So I think it could be this metaphorical mapping, it could be self-relevance, I don't know, but I feel like I don't have enough information to know. I think either is kind of interesting, and I think that it's interesting like how nuanced, the level of nuance we bring to defining like social relevance to ourselves with people who aren't our kin or who aren't our mating partners. So at least like really kind of flexible and variable, significant social relationships that we can like then define self-relevance in terms of. I think it's still interesting that maybe working in the same way as these really maybe more primitive and crudely ways of defining self-relevance based on like, is a ball about to hit you in the face, or is it moving away from you?
Oh, it's 4:29 anyhow, so with that, let us thank our speaker.